Ever get that like unsettling feeling? You know that chill that kind of runs down your spine when you hear about a crime that hits a little too close to home?
I know exactly what you mean.
Okay, so imagine, right?
Yeah.
This woman, beloved by her community, everyone calls her Ma, right?
Yeah.
Now, picture this. Her life is cut short in the one place that should be the absolute safest, her own home.
Tragic.
And that's the sadly true story of Viola Pendergrass.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 1992, her life was taken, and even after all these years, her case, it remains unsolved. We're going to dive deep into that today.
What gets me, about Viola's case is that it's this stark contrast between, like, the warmth of her personality and just the cold-blooded nature of how she was murdered.
Yeah.
She was 79 years old, a widow. She had faced hardship, losing her husband, and then she raised 11 children.
Wow.
Pretty much on her own, but, even with that, she managed to become a pillar of strength for both her family and her community.
That's almost unimaginable, to go through so much loss and still just radiate kindness, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You mentioned that she was known as Ma.
Right.
That says a lot about her impact.
Yeah, absolutely. It signifies a really deep-rooted respect and affection, that went beyond just blood ties, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
And she was like a source of comfort and support for her entire apartment complex. She sounds like she was almost like a universal grandmother figure.
It's amazing. It really makes the circumstances of her death that much more jarring. It was February 7th, 1992, when Viola's granddaughter, Iris, went to her apartment to drop off her son.
Uh-huh.
She did this every day, but that day something was off. The door was locked, which was unusual. So Iris gets a spare key, lets herself in, and finds Viola. Well, let's just say the scene was horrific.
Yeah, the crime scene details are pretty chilling. She was stabbed multiple times, sitting upright in a chair in her bedroom. A bloody knife, it was found near her body, and the phone was off the hook with blood on it. And the lack of forced entry, that's what raises red flags for me. Makes you wonder, why would Viola open her door to someone who meant to harm her?
Right.
It suggests maybe she knew her attacker or even trusted them.
That's a really disturbing thought, especially considering that, she had been robbed in the past. So there's that extra layer of betrayal that just adds to the tragedy.
Yeah, and that betrayal becomes even more poignant when you think about how she had actually expressed concerns about crime in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
She had even intervened in a situation where a man had pulled a gun on somebody else.
Oh, wow.
Which I think suggests that she wasn't naive about the potential dangers around her, and yet, despite all that, she still let her killer into her home.
Then to add yet another layer to this whole thing, the police found that $700 in cash, it was Viola's Social Security checks.
Wow.
That was missing from her dresser.
See, the missing money is what makes the motive a lot more complex, doesn't it?
For sure.
Was this a robbery that just went wrong? Or was the theft staged to, mislead the investigators,
Right.
And if it was a robbery, could it have been someone close to her, someone who knew she kept cash at home?
Yeah.
A lot of questions there.
To help us unpack that question, let's bring in the perspective of Viola's grandson, Christopher. He was really close with his grandmother. They talked on the phone almost every single day. When he learned about her murder, he was just devastated. He's been searching for answers ever since.
I can only imagine his grief. It must be just palpable, and you can tell his determination to get justice for her is just fueled by this really deep sense of loss. And, he believes that the killer had to have been someone Viola knew and trusted.
Right.
And, he bases that on her cautious nature, her personality, and her comments about the crime that was already happening in her neighborhood.
Makes sense. It's just heartbreaking to think about, the pain and the confusion that the family must have gone through, right?
Yeah.
Not only did they lose their beloved Ma, but they had to grapple with the idea that someone they knew, someone they might even love, could be behind it all.
And, that suspicion combined with the lack of answers and the fact that there were previous deaths from her, it just created a rift in the family.
Really?
Some thought that a family member was involved, while others were really defensive about it. They denied the accusations. It was just this added layer of complexity to this already really awful situation.
Tragic. It's a reminder that even a single event can really impact a family and leave scars, maybe forever.
You're right. The lack of closure, the fact that justice hasn't been served, it can really haunt a family for generations. And Viola's case, it remains unsolved. Despite all the efforts of the police, the killer is still out there.
Well, speaking of the investigation, let's get into the specifics of the steps the police took to try to solve this case. They definitely didn't let it just go cold.
No, they didn't.
They canvassed the neighborhood, Talk to people, chase down every lead. They even put together a civilian review board in 2003 to really take a fresh look at everything.
It's remarkable how committed they were to getting justice for Viola, even years after it happened.
Right.
They even set up a website in 2006 to try to generate new leads, and Detective Williams even went on the radio during the pandemic,
Yeah.
just to bring attention back to the case.
It's commendable, really, but you know as well as I do, even the most thorough investigations sometimes, they just hit a wall. And that's where the forensic evidence enters the picture.
Yeah.
Specifically, the mixed DNA profile that they found on Viola's phone. This offered a glimmer of hope, a potential lead to really crack the case wide open.
Oh, yeah, for sure. DNA technology has completely changed how criminal investigations are done. But, it's not as simple as find a match and you've solved it.
Right.
Even with the DNA profile, solving the crime can still be incredibly challenging. It's complex. In this case, they collected DNA samples from several of her relatives hoping for a match, but none of those initial samples aligned with what they found on the phone.
So what do? Just give up?
Oh, no, they weren't ready to do that. Not for Viola. They decided to go a step further, and they sent the DNA profile for forensic genealogy testing. Now, this is pretty new. It's a technique that could really have an impact on cracking cold cases. Basically, it lets investigators look for distant relatives of the unknown person by comparing the DNA to public databases.
So are you saying they're casting a really wide net to
Right.
catch someone that they might not even know exists?
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. It almost sounds like science fiction, tracing somebody's family tree just through their DNA. Did they get a hit?
Well, it's not quite like getting a direct hit. It's more complicated than that. But they did find a person of interest, a relative with a history of substance abuse, and he had allegedly stolen from Viola before. So it raised some suspicion, for sure. But when they tested his DNA against the sample on the phone, there was no match.
Hold on. So even though he was already kind of on their radar, this guy,
Mm.
and had a history with Viola, his DNA doesn't match the evidence at the crime scene.
Mm.
That's both frustrating and intriguing at the same time.
Absolutely. And that's a big challenge with these cold cases. DNA evidence can be amazing for excluding a suspect, but it doesn't always lead you directly to the person who did it. So the police, they think this person of interest, he might know more than he's letting on. But so far, there just isn't enough evidence to charge him with anything. It's like having these pieces of a puzzle, but you just can't figure out how to put them together.
So where does that leave us with the investigation?
That's where we'll pick things up in part 2. We're going to delve into all of the ongoing efforts to uncover the truth behind Viola's murder and, what's it been like for her family, the emotional toll.
This case, it really does keep you guessing. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of our deep dive into the unsolved murder of Viola Pendergrass. So we were talking about this person of interest in Viola's case, a relative with a past that definitely raises some questions. But his DNA didn't match what they found on the phone. What happens when even really strong leads just fizzle out? Where do investigators go from there?
It's gotta be frustrating. For the investigators, for the family, you have this person, he fits a profile, he's got a history with the victim, but the evidence, the hard evidence, doesn't lead to him. The police have to go back, rethink their theories, and try to find something new to explore.
It's like you found this missing puzzle piece, but then it turns out it's from a completely different puzzle. It's got to be so disheartening for her family, especially those who think this relative was involved. They're left with all this suspicion, but no real answers.
Yeah, the family, they go through so much. Not only did they lose someone they loved in such a horrible way, but then they have to live with the uncertainty of who did it and why. It's got to be so hard to move on.
It makes you realize how one event can have such a huge impact, not just on the victim, but on everyone they loved. And in Viola's case, this whole mystery surrounding her death has been hanging over her family for decades.
Think about it, 30 years with these unanswered questions. Imagine all the conversations they've had, all the theories, all the doubts, the accusations even, just swirling around within the family. For years, it's heavy, a burden to carry.
And it reminds us that justice is more than just catching whoever did it and punishing them, right? It's about giving the people left behind a sense of closure, some peace. And in Viola's case, well, that hasn't happened yet.
That's why it's so important to keep cases like hers in the public eye, even after all this time. Someone out there might have information, might know something that could help.
Right, it's like sending up a signal, hoping the right person sees it. Maybe they remember a detail they thought didn't matter at the time, a conversation they overheard, an encounter that seemed off. Even something small could make a difference.
And that's where the police come in, their work to keep this case alive, The website they set up, the radio broadcasts, it all helps.
It shows they're committed. They haven't forgotten Viola. And her family hasn't given up hope either. Speaking of hope, let's go back to the DNA just for a second. The samples they first took from relatives didn't give them a match, but then there's this forensic genealogy testing. Didn't that open up some new possibilities?
Absolutely. Forensic genealogy, it's changed everything. Investigators can look at these huge public DNA databases and try to build family trees. They can find suspects they never would have known about otherwise.
It's wild. Our DNA can tell us so much, not just about ourselves, but about our ancestors, too. It's almost like a map leading to places you'd never expect.
It's an amazing tool, and it has so much potential, especially for cold cases like this. It might not give instant answers, but it can lead to new leads, new paths to explore, new hope.
So it sounds like this technology could be a real game changer. But what about Viola's case specifically? Any sign that this forensic genealogy could be the key to solving it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's worked in other cases, but it's not a sure thing. It takes time, you have to analyze tons of data, and then there's the issue of privacy, using people's genetic information. It can be ethically tricky.
Right, you want to use this powerful technology, but you have to be careful about people's privacy too.
Sure.
But the goal here is justice for Viola.
Exactly. And while we wait to see what happens with the forensic genealogy, there are other things to look at too, like witness testimony that could still be huge. What if someone saw something but hasn't connected it to Viola's case?
What if someone has a piece of the puzzle but they don't realize it? Maybe they saw something strange or heard something but dismissed it. That could be what the investigators need.
That's why it's so important to keep people talking about this, keep them aware. The more people who know about Viola, the better the chances that someone will remember something that could help.
It shows that we all have a part to play in finding justice, not just for Viola, but for anyone who's been a victim of a crime that's gone unsolved. If we all pay attention, work together, we can be a powerful force.
That's a good point. Keeping these stories alive, having these conversations, it all helps. It means we won't forget the victims and we won't stop fighting for justice.
So what does it say about a community when someone like Viola, someone who dedicated her life to helping others, becomes the victim of such a senseless act of violence?
Well, it's a reminder that even in close-knit communities, bad things can happen. It makes you question your sense of safety because it shows that anyone can be vulnerable anywhere.
It's a tough pill to swallow, and it shows how important it is to look out for each other, to be there for each other.
And it also shows how long the effects of trauma can last. When there are no answers, no closure, it leaves a community feeling uneasy, wanting justice.
And in Viola's case, that need for justice is still as strong as it was 30 years ago. The investigation's still going on. They haven't given up on finding her killer. And everyone who knew and loved her, they still remember her.
And that brings us to the heart of this deep dive, the real cost of these unsolved crimes. The families who are left with questions, the communities that are left feeling unsafe, and the victims whose stories deserve to be told and remembered.
It's a reminder that justice is about more than just the legal stuff. It's about healing, about finally being able to move on, and about honoring the people who were lost. And in Viola's case, that journey toward justice is still going on.
And in part 3, we're going to continue exploring that journey. We'll look at the ongoing investigation, how the case has impacted her family and the community.
This is one of those cases that stays with you. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the last part of our deep dive into the unsolved murder of Viola Pendergrass.
So we spent the last couple parts really digging into this tragic story of Viola Pendergrass. Remember, she was such a beloved figure in her community, and back in 1992, her life was just taken. We've talked about the crime scene itself, gone through all those different leads, those dead ends, and really looked at how much this unsolved murder has affected her family and her whole community. But even with all of that, with all the darkness surrounding this case, there's still this glimmer of hope. And it comes from forensic genealogy, this fairly new technique. It could be the answer to finally finding out the truth.
Yeah, forensic genealogy has really become an important tool for investigators who work on cold cases.
Yeah.
And it might be especially helpful with Viola's case.
Yeah?
So they're comparing these DNA profiles to all these huge public databases. And what they're doing is basically tracing family trees to try to find even distant relatives of whoever left their DNA on Viola's phone.
Right. It's a way to find connections and leads that no one would have ever thought of before.
I mean, it's like, imagine you're connecting dots across different generations,
Mm-hmm.
finding these hidden relationships, all through DNA. It's
And it
amazing.
is pretty incredible, yeah.
Could this be what Viola's family has been waiting for all this time? Could this new technology finally bring her killer to justice?
Well, it's definitely promising, you know. This forensic genealogy, it has a lot of potential, but we have to remember it's a process and it takes time, a lot of it.
Yep.
And you have to be really thorough, very carefully look at all the data. And there are those privacy concerns too, right? We have to think about the ethics of using genetic information like this when we're talking about criminal investigations.
Right. So it's all about finding that balance,
Right.
using this incredible technology,
Right.
but being responsible and ethical about it. At the end of the day, though, the most important thing is getting justice for Viola.
Exactly. And while we're waiting to see what happens with all of that, the forensic genealogy stuff, there's something else that we shouldn't forget about. Human memory can play a role in this too.
You're saying someone out there might actually have a key piece of information, and they don't even know it.
Exactly. Think about it. Someone might have seen something unusual around her apartment around the time she was killed, or maybe overheard a conversation that seemed like nothing at the time. But looking back on it, it could have a whole new meaning.
Right.
You know, it's totally possible that someone has a detail that seems really small, something they saw or heard, or something that just slipped their mind. But now, after all this time, and knowing more about the case, it could be like a light bulb moment. Wait a minute. What if that's important?
I get it, yeah. It means we have to keep Viola's story in people's minds.
Okay.
Keep reminding them that even something that seems tiny could be the missing piece of the puzzle. It also reminds us that we all have a responsibility here. You know, it's not just about finding justice for Viola, it's about fighting for justice for all those victims whose cases are still unsolved. We need to work together, be aware, and maybe that can make a difference.
Exactly. Working together is key. Collective memory, being vigilant, and being willing to speak up, it could make all the difference in the world, especially with a case like Viola's.
Her story, it's like this stark reminder that these unsolved crimes have consequences. And not just for the families who lost someone, but for the whole community. When there's no closure, when questions are left unanswered, it makes people feel uneasy, and it starts to break down that sense of trust.
Yeah, it's like an open wound, you know? It's a constant reminder that justice hasn't been served. And with Viola, well, her family and community have been living with that for over 30 years. But even with all of that, that pain, the hope is still there. The hope that someday they'll finally have some answers.
And that's really where we are now, at the end of this whole deep dive. We've faced this awful tragedy, we've seen how complex it all is, but we haven't given up on hope. We still hope that somehow justice will be served.
And even though we may never fully understand why this happened, this senseless act of violence, we can still honor Viola by continuing to search for the truth, by not letting anyone forget, and by supporting her family who are still grieving after all this time.
Viola Pendergrass, the Ma to her community. She deserved a much better ending to her story. I hope her story makes everyone rededicate themselves to solving her case,
Yeah.
to bringing whoever did this to justice, and to finally giving her family the closure they deserve.
It's what she deserves.
Thanks for joining us as we went deep into this cold case. And remember, even the smallest detail could be crucial. If you know anything at all about Viola Pendergrass's murder, reach out to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. You might be the one who helps bring this tragic case to a close.
Until next time, keep that curiosity alive, stay informed, and never stop searching for the truth.